So now it's time to talk about the most crucial aspect of this masterclass, game monetization, or simply how to make money with your games. Without game monetization, there's no way that a games developer can sustain any kind of marketing or pay for the management of their game or their players. And just as games have been around for decades, so too has game monetization. In this section, we're going to very quickly cover the history of game monetization before diving more deeply into the best ways and methods to monetize your games today. Growing up as a gamer in the 1980s was very different to growing up as a gamer today. Back in those days, the only real way to be able to try out a game would be to pay for it in advance. And back in those days, games were very expensive, averaging about $50 per game. In today's equivalent, about $120. And accordingly, the art of game monetization was also much simpler back in those days because everything was prepaid and delivered via a retail box set. This prepaid model of game monetization lasted for decades, and all throughout the 1990s, there was very little disruption or innovation in terms of how games would get monetized, with the first challenge for prepaid retail box set monetization coming from companies like Paradox and Steam in the form of digital games delivery. Digital delivery for games dramatically decreased the cost involved in creating box sets and distributing game software inside of paper boxes all around the world, and hence it was able to generate a vast decrease in the price of games via platforms like Steam. Also, digital delivery of games enabled some innovations in monetization as well as game delivery, enabling the framework of what we now call DLCs, or downloadable content. Even with digital delivery, however, the model via which games developers and publishers monetize their games remained little changed throughout the entire 1990s and most of the 2000s. It was still a predominantly prepaid model. Now, fast forward to today, and the gaming industry is now a $100 billion plus a year business, of which more than 80% of revenue is derived not from the prepaid model, but from the free-to-play model. In particular, the mobile games market, which consists of more than 50% of total games market revenue, is dominated by free-to-play. With this context in mind, we're going to be focusing the monetization segment of this masterclass to helping you understand the key methods and philosophies around free-to-play game monetization, particularly for the mobile games segment in the industry. Fundamentally, there are only two core philosophies governing the design of free-to-play games. Rule number one: anyone at any time can download and play your game without having to pay any money. And rule number two is that anyone who has downloaded your game can continue to play that game and expect to be able to get new content updates without having to pay any money unless they wanted to. So, with these two rules in mind, the entire focus of free-to-play game monetization design is about, firstly, how do I make money without players having to pay for it? And secondly, how do I design and package my content so that players will want to pay for it even though they don't have to? There are two mainstream methods that we use to achieve these objectives: in-game mobile ads and in-app purchases, or IAPs. Depending on the kind of game that you have, and more importantly, the kind of audience that you're trying to target, you'll likely use a different mix of ads and IAP in your monetization strategy. Many game developers that I've talked to over the years will determine their mix of IAPs and ads that they'll use in their monetization strategy based on the type of game that they're making. For example, developers of hyper-casual games tend to lean more heavily on ad monetization and less so on IAPs. Conversely, developers of more hardcore strategy games will lean almost exclusively on IAPs, often not using ad monetization at all within their games. Although determining game monetization strategy based on game genre will sometimes work, the biggest problem with designing monetization strategy by game genre is that you don't know why it works and you don't know why it doesn't work when it doesn't. And if you don't understand why it works, you really can't fine-tune and improve your monetization strategy over time. This brings us to the discussion of the first key concept of monetization design: understanding your game's demographic mix. A good understanding of the demographic makeup of your player base is critical to crafting a successful and effective monetization strategy. The reason is because different kinds of players will monetize in different ways. Although gender does play a role in monetization strategy, the most impactful demographic aspect to pay attention to when designing your monetization strategy is age demographic. For the purposes of this masterclass, let's use 4 different levels of age demographic classification, and let's take a look at the different behavior that each of these groups may exhibit when faced with either ad monetization or IAP-based monetization. The first group is the preteens groups, a player base that we typically define as 12 or under. Typically, the preteens audience don't mind watching ads inside of a game, especially if it's an incentivized ad format which allows them to get some kind of in-game reward out of the ad experience. From an IAP monetization perspective though, preteen player audiences tend to have a low threshold or gaming budget that they're able to spend consistently on games. The second group is our teenage player audiences, one of the sweet spot demographics in mobile gaming today. Like the preteens, the teenage group has a high tolerance for ad monetization, especially if it's well-designed, incentivized ads. In addition, they also tend to have a small but regular gaming budget that they can allocate to spending in IAP in your games. The third group in our demographic definition is the young adults group, which we define as young adults aged 19 through 30. Young adults are one of the most active and high-value gaming demographic groups. They tend to have a medium to high regular gaming budget that they allocate to spending in games, and although they have a tolerance for in-game ads, they often much prefer spending a little bit of money on IAP if it can get them a better gaming experience. Last but not least is the mature adults group. This group of players tend to have a much lower tolerance level for ad monetization, especially if it's non-optional ads which are forced upon the player experience. Conversely though, they also have one of the highest disposable income and gaming budget levels, so designing the right IAP monetization strategy to attract the mature adult audience can yield great returns for your game's monetization. So, assuming that we've ascertained that a good proportion of your game's target demographic players fall into the first 2 to 3 groups of the age demographic, let's start looking at your ad monetization design strategy. The first thing that we need to consider are all of the mainstream ad types that are prevalent and available inside of mobile games. These ad types will all fall into 2 categories of user experience. The first kind of ad experience are the non-optional ad experiences. Non-optional ads is something that consumers have grown used to over the years. They're often seen as a necessary evil in order for consumers to be able to enjoy free content, whether it's in the form of video content on TV or YouTube, or in our case, game content. Non-optional ad types, which are currently mainstream in the mobile games market, include interstitial ad types, which are injected or appear at certain defined points within the game and typically take over the entire game screen. And banner ad types that typically take up a portion of your game's user interface, but are typically constantly displayed whenever a player visits that section of your game's interface. The key thing to master when designing monetization with non-optional ads is frequency. Display too many ads in a short period of time, and you could be driving away your players with a bad game and ad experience, lowering your game's retention. Play too few ads, and you could be leaving a significant amount of money on the table and hurting the monetization for your game. And the metric that we use to measure the frequency of ads displayed is called impressions per DAU. In simple terms, it's the average number of ads that we would display to a single active user in a single day of game experience. The key things to remember about optimizing the impressions per DAU for your game is that every game has a different sweet spot. You can certainly reference the impressions per DAU frequency of other popular games that are similar to yours, but at the end of the day, the best way to decide the optimal impressions per DAU for your game is through experimentation and A/B testing. The second important thing to remember is that the optimal impressions per DAU may change over time as the player demographics change within your game, as well as the tolerance that each demographic has for non-optional ads changes over time. While the objective with non-optional ads is to achieve optimal monetization without annoying and driving away your player base, the challenge and objective of optional ad formats is much more interesting. The most prevalent type of optional ad is the rewarded video format. Since players don't have to watch an optional ad and they need to be encouraged to watch the ad, the challenge with designing optional ad types is how do I encourage and incentivize players to watch more ads while they're playing the game. Just like non-optional ads, optional ad types can take many forms. The mainstream types of optional ads inside of mobile games include rewarded video, rewarded playable ads, as well as offer walls. In general, we would refer to these ad types as incentivized or rewarded ad types, where the goal is to design incentives which encourage the players to want to watch these ads. The interesting thing about rewarded or incentivized ad types is that their monetization design is much more similar to IAP monetization design than it is to non-optional ads monetization design. So much so that we would treat the monetization design of rewarded video ads alongside and together with IAP monetization design. And this takes us to the next framework in the monetization segment, designing a game economy. An economy can be simply defined as a system for the production, consumption, and exchange of goods and services using a commonly agreed mechanic for exchange, something that we'll call a currency. In a game economy, the content that we produce within the game constitute the goods and services of an economy. The consumers of this content are our players, and we, as the game's developers, are the producers of this content. So, as the creators of this game economy, the last thing that we need to define is the currency, the means with which we exchange content with our players. Just like in a real economy, where the consumers and producers have placed an agreed upon value on certain currencies, like a country's national currency, or precious commodities like gold and silver, game economies in free-to-play mobile games have also evolved to accept a few mainstream types of commonly accepted currency. The first currency that we accept as producers of free-to-play games content is time invested by a player. Let's call this the time currency. The second currency that we accept is ad currency, or the money derived from a player watching an ad. And the third type of currency that we accept, of course, is IAP, or real money that players spend to buy content within our games. Finally, we can also create derived currencies like gems, gold, energy, tokens, whatever it is. But all of these currencies are typically exchanged and derived using the other three major currencies of time, ads, or IAP. So now that we know what currencies we accept for our content, let's start packaging our content into a way that it can be consumed by players and can be exchanged for currency. In free-to-play mobile games, we like to view content in three different ways. The first type of content is what we call progression content. Typically, progression content can be unlocked by any player simply through playing or investing time currency to earn these content unlocks. Typical examples of progression content are leveling up within your game, whereby players will unlock new levels, new characters, or new abilities as they invest time to level up within the game. For a match-3 or puzzle game, for example, the progression content would be chapters and levels that unlock as the player invests time to complete different levels and unlock new chapters and content. The second type of good that we can package within our game are what we call functional content. Functional content has an impact on the player's experience and their ability to complete and consume other content. For example, buff items inside of a game that provide the player with a functional enhancement to the gaming experience would be an example of functional content. Boosters in a match-free game, revives in an endless runner game. All of these things that give a functional impact or enhancement to the player's game experience can be categorized into functional content. The third and final major type of content within a free-to-play game is vanity content. Vanity content, as its name implies, makes the player's experience look better or feel better, but doesn't necessarily impart any functional benefits towards gameplay. Specific examples of vanity content include player avatars, character skins, shiny items that look great and have special effects, but don't impart any functional benefit towards gameplay. The important thing to note about these three types of content packaging is that they don't have to be mutually exclusive. For example, you can match functional contents with vanity contents and create a class of functional vanity items that can be sold for different kinds of currencies. Content packaging is important because it's one of the primary methods via which we impact a main goal of game monetization, and that is to create a desire to purchase within the players. Once we've packaged our content in such a way that it generates a desire to purchase by the players, we then need to look at the second objective of game monetization, and that is to promote and price our packaged content in such a way that we create a perception of value by the player base. For example, given that in a free-to-play game, all content within the game can eventually be earned for free by the player just through playing, how do you create the perception of value that watching an ad or paying some amount of money is better value than investing your time? And the way that you balance, fine-tune, and also influence the perception of value for your content packages within your game is by creating comparative options. For example, if there's a functional vanity item within your game called the Whirlpool Sword, and typically it takes a player anywhere from 12 to 24 hours of gameplay time in order to attain that item, can we also create another currency via which the player can obtain this item in a shorter time? Maybe each day they can watch an ad that gives them a period of time that increases their drop rate for this item, hence reducing the amount of time that they need to invest in order to obtain this item. Or you could create a content package like a loot box that costs $1 to buy and has a good chance of dropping the Whirlpool blade. By creating options for players of different currencies, whether it's investing their play time, investing their time to watch an ad, or to spend some money in order to be able to obtain that item, you create a comparison via which they can decide which type of content and which currency provides them with the most value. And this takes us to the third objective of effective game monetization: pricing your content affordably and attractively to all demographic audience groups. To understand how to do this properly, we need to understand the concept of price elasticity. Price elasticity determines how much of a certain good you can sell to a particular audience at a certain price. What this means from a monetization design perspective is that charging more for an item doesn't necessarily equate to you making more money. In fact, most of the time, charging a higher price simply means you sell less of each item. There are two things that you should really think about when designing and optimizing for price elasticity. Firstly, understand your demographic audience groups and think about what price is completely affordable for each group of audiences. Secondly, consider offering the item in different currencies so that different demographic groups can all afford it by either spending real money, watching ads, or investing time. For example, you might price an offer that highly desirable Whirlpool Sword in your game by selling it for $10 direct purchase IAP. Or players could earn the same item by investing 20 to 40 hours of gameplay time, with an option for shortening the time investment requirement by watching ads. By pricing your item in this way, you've created a situation where every demographic group in your game can affordably attain the item, either through an investment of time playing the game, an investment of time watching ads, or a direct purchase with real money. Adult audiences may prefer to not spend a lot of time and instead pay $10 and buy the item. Whereas teens or preteen audiences may prefer to play the game and watch a few ads to shorten the playtime required in order to obtain the item. So before we jump into a real-life example of how to apply the concepts of monetization that you've learned in this section, let's do a quick review of the key concepts that we've covered. Firstly, we've learned about how to design an effective game economy, including the currencies that we use to exchange goods and services or content that we can package as a producer for players to consume. Secondly, we've covered the basics of the 3 objectives of effective game monetization: creating content packages that are highly desirable for players to purchase. Secondly, tying that content to different currencies such as playtime invested, ad time invested, or real money IAP, so that different demographic groups from preteens to mature adults can have an option to earn or purchase this content using the currency that players view gives them the best perception of value. And lastly, we've talked about the 3rd objective of effective game monetization, which is pricing your content affordably in a variety of different currencies so that different players can afford to consume your content, so that you can optimize the amount of revenue generated by setting the right price elasticity levels. Now let's take a look at how these concepts can be applied in practice inside of Rodeo Stampede. Rodeo Stampede is a game that bridges 2 different game genres using the casual endless runner genre and combining it with a mid-core zoo building metagame. Based on these 2 hybrid genres, we had expected that the game to draw mostly a teen and preteen audience, with also the mid-core zoo building experience attracting a decent proportion of young adults and some mature adults. And hence, we opted for a dual monetization approach using a combination of both ads and IAP monetization within the game. Back in 2016, when we were preparing to geotest Rodeo Stampede, the non-optional ad types such as interstitial video and banner ads had a relatively bad player experience, and also their value was relatively low. So we opted for the dual approach of using rewarded video incentivized ad types in combination with IAP. During the 6 months of geotesting, we pretty much confirmed our demographic projections, and the combination of rewarded video ads and IAP were monetizing well throughout the first year of Rodeo Stampede's launch, with incentivized video ads deriving about 70% of the game's revenue and IAPs pulling in the remaining 30%. And as we analyzed our player base's behavior, we identified that the most highly desired content type that we offered in the game were new maps and new animals, which could be found in these new maps. This validated that we were on the right path to creating highly desirable content, and we focused more of our efforts on creating new maps and new and rarer animal types. But at the same time, as we were analyzing player progression behavior, we were finding at certain points within the game, we would see larger amounts of player drop-off as the grind time or the cost of time investment required increased significantly in order for players to unlock new maps and hence new animals. Hence, we're observing that the player's perception of value for the content being unlocked was decreasing over time as we were increasing the time cost required to unlock new content. Basically, it was time for us to rebalance parts of our economy so that we could sustain a high perception of value by the player base for the content that was being unlocked or purchased. Besides just tuning the amount of time required to unlock new content or tuning the cost in one currency, we also introduced new monetization mechanics which would allow players to shorten the time to unlock content through watching ads. We also experimented with the option to sell certain select maps directly via IAP to test the player's perception of value and their willingness to pay real money to accelerate unlocking map content. Thus, we were evolving our monetization strategy from a point whereby highly desirable content such as maps could primarily only be obtained via gameplay with some ad options to a more diverse strategy where map content, which is highly desirable, can now be obtained via time investment, ad investment, or directly via IAP. And since this was the first time that we had made maps available for direct purchase via IAP, we also set up a series of live ops experiments to test the correct price elasticity levels for each of these maps. ranging from $1 per map to $4 per map. The introduction of IAP to obtain maps proved extremely effective, and the revenue mix between ads and IAP shifted in favor of IAP, increasing from 30% to 40% of total revenue. More importantly, the overall LTV for each average player was also increasing at a significant rate, proving to us that we were not simply shifting the mix between ad and IAP revenue, but were in fact growing the pie. By the third year of Rodeo Stampede's operation, new trends were emerging in the mobile game space. The hyper-casual game genre had started to boom, and these kind of games made extensive use of non-optional ad types such as interstitial video and interstitial playable ads. The player experience of these ad types had improved significantly since Rodeo Stampede launched, and more importantly, the popularity of hyper-casual games had also started to change player demographic behavior. They were becoming much more tolerant of non-optional ad types. So once again, we looked at how we could optimize our monetization strategy to take advantage of non-optional ad types by setting up a series of experiments and A/B tests to determine the tolerance level that the Rodeo Stampede player base had for non-optional ad types such as interstitial video. Over the next few months of fine-tuning and balancing, we were able to increase the overall player LTV once again. And once again, the monetization revenue mix started shifting back slightly towards ad monetization. Today, Rodeo Stampede is now entering its 5th year online. We continue to do experiments via live ops events to test and ascertain that we maintain the right price elasticity levels and the right perception of value for our player base at any given point in time. And as the game evolves, it's expected that the mix between ad monetization and IAP monetization will change over time. But over time, our goal will remain the same, and that is to drive higher player LTVs using the right mix of ad and IAP monetization or new mechanics that come onto the market at any point in time.